Hello, and welcome to Conflict Resolution Contentment in the Classroom. This is the second week video. Hopefully you've done the first reading, Interpersonal Conflict. It's really important that you do that reading before looking at this video. There's a lot of concepts that are in the reading that pertain to this video. And if you haven't done it, please go back because you're going to be a little bit confused. So let's talk about this week. What is a conflict? Is a conflict a fight? Is conflict a disagreement? Is a conflict a fist fight? Is have to involve people hurting each other? What's all involved in a conflict? Well, first of all, I think we should put some definitions down. Most people think that an argument and a conflict is the same thing. I see them as two individual concepts. So first of all, let's look at what an argument is. An argument is an exchange of views. So when you're talking with somebody, you're trying to give them your view. The second part of this is they're trying to persuade you that their view is different than yours. And I think that this is the biggest difference between what a conflict and an argument is that you're trying to change somebody else's view or prove to them that they are right or wrong on a situation. That other person is trying to do the same thing to you. And that's where the tension between the two people is. Now, if we look at what a conflict is when two or more people perceive a behavior act differently. We're going to talk about perceptions in a second, but something has to happen between two individuals, and this is this behavior act. And when this behavior act happens, it can be a good behavior act, it can be a bad behavior act, it could be a neutral behavior act. But there has to be something that happens between two individuals. The other person, when they view that behavior act, the perception of it is different than your perception. And this is what causes a conflict. Okay? Now, let's talk about perceptions for a little bit. I want you for a second to picture an apple. What is an apple to you? Okay. Now, my perception of an apple might be similar to yours, or it could be different. So when I perceive an apple, I perceive a red apple. And one of the reasons why I perceive a red apple, and in particular it's a red delicious apple, is when I was a kid, my mom used to give me red delicious apples in my lunchbox. And I remember crunching on them and the sweetness of them. Now, it's not that I don't perceive or have a perception that the apple could be green. It's just that my perception when it first comes to mind of what a true apple is, it's a red apple because that's the way I grew up. Now later on in life, my grandmother used to make apple pies with green apples, and I loved them. They're great. But I'm talking about your first perception is how you see something. Okay? Now, my perception of an apple, was it similar to yours? Or was it different than yours? Everybody perceives an apple in a different way. If I were to pick a sports car, you may think of a Lamborghini or a Porsche. I may think of a 5 Series BMW. But it's that perception that we have when we name objects is how we see it in our mind or how we perceive or how we view this behavior act causes a conflict. There's a little comic strip that I like to show people. Gives you an idea. I'm pretty sure that the doctor in this has a different perception than the patient here. So I'll let you look at this for a second. So let's talk about the lens model. On page 26 in Interpersonal Conflict, it talks about the lens model. And the lens model of conflict. There are three minimum features of a conflict: a communication act, a behavior between two individual persons. It could be two, it could be three, it could be four, it could be a group of individuals. But some sort of communication act has to happen. Now, the second thing is there needs to be some sort of relationship between the two people that have perceived this communication act. Now, depending on the behavior act, such as, example, a hug. Now, if somebody gives you a hug, which is a communication act, some sort of behavior, and they're friends, that may be all right. But if we look at the relationship between somebody that's a stranger to you that you don't know and they give you a hug, there could be some sort of conflict. And the last is the meaning, the attribution obtained by the act of each individual person. So when that behavior happens, example is the hug, it's how that person perceives the hug. It's their cultural awareness of what a hug is. It's what they've done growing up with a mother giving a hug or a father giving a hug. It's something that they put meaning behind of what that behavior act is. So, for example, the hug, if a stranger gives you to it, as an individual, if you don't know this person giving you a hug, the meaning of that hug is some sort of relationship, some sort of mutual respect between each other. But if it's a stranger, you don't know this person, you understand the behavior act is a positive one, but if a stranger gives you a hug, it may scare you. So hopefully you understand that. So let's break these down and have a better understanding of these three features. Let's talk about what the lens model is and get a better understanding of how this theory works. So if we had a perfect world, everybody would see 20/20. If we put an object up, everybody would be able to perceive it or see it similar. But we all know that we don't have a perfect world. Some people see 20/20, some people see 20/50. As in the case of my wife, she wears glasses and she sees 2400. Now, for her to focus on something, she actually has to put a lens on. So she puts these glasses on, which enables her to see objects clearer. Now, if she takes this lens off, then she's not going to be able to see objects as clear. So if we go a little bit further into this, let's talk about filters, are another form of a lens. And the way I like to look at this as almost putting like sunglasses on. Now, sunglasses are for when you're out in the sun, they protect your eyes. Filters are not good nor bad, depending on when you use them. So for example is, if you have sunglasses on when it's bright and sunny out, helps your eyes, makes you see things a little bit more clear. But if you put those sunglasses on when you're in the dark or in not a well-lit area, what ends up happening, it's going to distort the way you see things. So let's look at an example of this dog. Now, when you look at this dog, if you've grown up with dogs, this is a very cute, lovable animal. And so your filter, your lens that you put on your eyes and the way you view this is that maybe you had a dog when you're growing up, you're going to view this in a different, you're going to view this in a certain light. Now, if you didn't grow up with dogs, or maybe when you were younger, a dog bit you, then that filter is going to be a little bit different. The way you're going to view this dog is maybe a little bit scary. It's going to change your perception of how you see things. And this is what the lens model of conflict talks about, is when you look at a behavior act, depending on the way you've grown up, the way you perceive a behavior act, is what type of filters you put on. So let's look at different type of filters that are out there. So as you go through life, you realize that there's different cultures out there. Now, somebody that lives in Africa, somebody that lives in Europe, somebody that lives in North America, South America, Central America is going to view behavior acts differently. Now, also in our own country, your gender is going to affect how you view behavior acts. Even if you're from the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, anytime you view a behavior act, all of these filters come into play and give you a different perception of how to view things. What are other possibility of filters can you think of that could change somebody's perception? Yeah, I think that we can all think of a lot of filters. So any sort of behavior act that happens on a day-to-day basis of even saying hello or accidentally bumping into somebody, is going to change your perception of what happens in that behavior act. So what is a behavior act? What am I talking about when we look at a behavior act? What a behavior act is some sort of communication between two individuals. Now, this communication can be verbal, it can be nonverbal. A verbal action is somebody saying something inappropriate to you. Or a nonverbal action, somebody bumps into you, or you're in a conversation with 2 or 3 people and somebody says something and somebody rolls their eyes at somebody. It's almost impossible in a day-to-day activity, even if you don't speak, but as soon as you meet up with somebody or see another individual, there's some sort of communication that happens minute by minute. Now, this behavior act can happen even when the other person doesn't realize it. And it can cause a conflict. And I'll give you an example of this. Say you're late for a meeting and you're at your workplace and you're walking down a hall realizing that if you walk, you're going to be really late. So you kind of pick up the pace and start to run. And when you run, you bump into a coworker accidentally. Now you're so focused on that meeting that you're late to that you don't even realize that you've bumped into this coworker. Now, there still is a behavior, a communication exchange between you and the coworker. Now that coworker may think their perception of it is that you've done it on purpose, or that you were trying to be mean to them by bumping into them. And you may not even realize that you bumped into that person. So communication this behavior act can cause conflict without you even realizing it. Another thing is some communication acts is acceptable in one culture, but may not be acceptable in another culture. And I'll give you an example of this. I had a good friend of mine that was doing a project in Nigeria. And when he was doing this project in Nigeria, he was doing a training exercise. And when somebody did something correct, he gave them the thumbs up. And a lot of people know that when you give the thumbs up to somebody, that in this country, it means that they're doing a good job. But that meaning or that behavior act is quite different to a Nigerian. In Nigeria, if you give the thumbs up to somebody, it's basically like flipping somebody off or giving somebody the bird, which is the opposite response that one of my professors wanted to give during this training exercise. Now, the second part of this lens model of conflict is the relationship between two or more people involved. The reason why this is important is a behavior act between friends could be quite different than a behavior act between somebody you don't know. So I'm going to give you some examples. If you are walking down the street and you say hi to somebody that's your friend, probably going to say hi back. Coworker, same thing. Even a stranger saying hello to you is not that out of the norm. Spouses, family. Usually that kind of behavior act is not going to cause a conflict. Now, I'm not saying it's not going to cause a conflict, but usually it doesn't. Now, we talked about earlier a hug. Now, if you give a friend a hug, one of your family members a hug, or a spouse a hug, the relationship is probably going to be acceptable of that hug. Now, if a stranger walks up to you and gives you a hug, or a coworker gives you a hug, that probably can cause a conflict because the relationship that you have between each other doesn't allow them to come up and give that behavior act to you. Now, an argument is quite different than a conflict in this situation, because if you have an argument between two friends, you're trying to persuade your view on them. Where in the lens model of conflict is that you have a behavior that happens between two friends, and the behavior and your perception of that is different, and the behavior act is what's causing the conflict. Okay, let's go on to the last part of this. The last part of this is probably one of the most important is the meaning, and that is the attribution. What do we put on that behavior act? What kind of meaning do we have to put on this behavior act? And most of the biggest problem that we're having is something called an attribution error. And this is the definition of the attribution error. And putting it kind of in layman's term is, if you have you and somebody else do the exact behavior act, usually you put a positive spin on that behavior act when you do it. But when somebody else does that same behavior, you go ahead and spin it a little bit negative. Also, what we do is when that behavior act happens, when you do that behavior act, it's usually because of external factors. But when the other person does that same exact behavior act, it's usually because of internal characteristics. So let me give you a little bit of example. Running late to a meeting. Everybody's late. So let's talk about the individual that walks in late to a meeting. So the behavior is that they're late. Okay? The relationship is all the coworkers that are around and then the person that walks in. The meaning behind it is not the person that's walking into the room, but the behavior or the meaning that you put on that behavior act is kind of negative. Also that it's an internal characteristic. That person is late because maybe they're lazy, or maybe they don't care about their job, or they're late because of the fact that they don't want to be there. Now let's turn it around. You're late to that meeting. The Behavior Act is still a conflict because you're walking in to that meeting late. That's the behavior. The relationship, again, is the individuals that are in that room and you. Now, your meaning when you walk in there is that you were stuck in traffic. Your meaning is that your alarm clock didn't go off, or your babysitter didn't come in time to pick up your kids. They're all external factors. So we can see how a conflict is developed in this kind of situation is that meaning that we put on that Behavior Act. If we take the fact that the person walking into the room is late because of internal characteristics, that they're lazy or that they don't care about their jobs, then we can cause a conflict because of the fact that that behavior is inappropriate. But if you do it, or that person that's walking in, their meaning towards it is they have external factors that are going on in their lives that have caused their Behavior Act to be inappropriate. So I hope that makes sense. So let's kind of regroup in this situation. An argument is two individuals that have opposite views, and they're trying to persuade the other person that their idea is right or wrong, or change them to their own view. A conflict is when two or more people perceive a Behavior Act differently. The lens model of conflict is there's three minimum features. There has to be some sort of communication act between two or more individuals. What is the relationship of those two individuals? Are they friends? Are they strangers? That's going to change the way they view the Behavior Act. And then also is that attribution, that meaning. What meaning does those individuals that are involved in the conflict put on that Behavior Act? If you put all these together, you have individuals that are having a conflict because they perceive that Behavior Act a certain way. And that's what's causing the conflict. There are several Behavior Acts that happen in the workplace on a daily basis. Now, it depends if you're friends with your coworkers, or they're new coworkers, or lifelong coworkers, or maybe you don't get along with the coworkers. The relationship that you have with your coworkers is going to affect all of those Behavior Acts that happen on a daily basis. And then we also add in that everybody has a different filter. Men, women, different cultures, age, gender. There are all these filters that happen in a day-to-day work life that's going to change everybody's meaning or views on that Behavior Act. So we can see how much conflict happens on a daily basis. This is the end of the video for week 2. For your journal entry, I'd like you to ask the question, to email me, is your last journal entry a conflict under the lens model of conflict theory definition, and why? I look forward to the next video. Thank you.